I'm going to talk about the rise of the Mahayana. Okay, let's define a few terms here. Mahayana means greater vehicle. The yana part means vehicle. Okay. Today, Buddhists generally divide Buddhism in retrospect into the Mahayana schools, the Hinayana schools, that means lesser vehicle, and the Vajrayana schools. That means literally the diamond vehicle or thunder vehicle. And we're going to talk about that more, the Vajrayana, when we do Tibet. Right now, we're still in India. Okay, Mahayana Buddhism arises in India, is flourishing by the 1st century of the contemporary era. It will be the predominant flavor of Buddhism, if you will, in most of East Asia, including China, much of Southeast Asia, Japan, certainly. It will also be very largely represented when Buddhism comes to the West. So, such schools as Zen that are familiar to Westerners are Mahayana schools. On the other hand, people who have studied Vipassana meditation are actually studying a practice that is largely from the Theravada school, Path of the Elders, which is one of the Hinayana schools. Now, by the 1st century, there was a major university called Nalanda in northern India. There were 18 different schools of Buddhism flourishing. Okay? Now, when we say that there are different schools, say of theology or religion or philosophy or politics or whatever, we generally see them as rivals. That's a Western way of thinking. As David Hume put it in his dialogues concerning natural religions, what is different is contrary in religion. But of course, he was only thinking of Western religions, where people are prone traditionally to say, this is the right way, this is the right path, this is the right scripture, these are the right rules. 18 different schools, to a large extent, would have been seen as complementary, viewing the same thing from 18 different perspectives. Remember the term upaya from previous lectures, skill and means. Well, if you have 18 different schools, you have many, many, many different approaches to exactly the same goal and many of the same practices. They overlap, they have resemblance to one another. They are not necessarily rivals, although there certainly was debate, but debate was a way of helping to clarify. Okay? Something happens and Buddhism fades into the background in India. Now, what exactly happens? Well, it's sort of a perfect storm, if you will. For one thing, this pluralism I was just talking about means that many people will be practicing Buddhism, but will also be practicing Hinduism at the same time. During the 1970s, I was in Sri Lanka, and I remember a farmer saying to me that he was both a Hindu and a Buddhist, that when he wanted to be a better person, he looked to the teachings of the Buddha, and when he wanted rain for his crops, he prayed to Indra. Okay, now that's been a very, very traditional approach. There are different approaches to religion that provide different aspects of life. So it's not as though if there were no Buddhist monasteries, no Buddhist monks, no Buddhist texts or whatever that you could turn to, that you would have no religious practice left. And essentially, Buddhist practice and Hindu practice were merging into one another. A number of Buddhist doctrines had been more or less absorbed into Hinduism and transformed a number of schools of Hindu thought. Something that Gandhi pointed out. Someone asked Mahatma Gandhi in the 20th century, whatever happened to Buddhism in India? And he said, oh, it's still there, but it's just been absorbed into Hinduism, where it is now practiced as a part of Hinduism. And you know, that is accurate in some respects. In other respects, it's not quite accurate. But many Hindu scriptures begin talking about neti, which means not this, not that. Okay, well, what on earth is that about? Well, the way it spells out is something very much like the Buddhist anatta doctrine, without going so far as to say there is no Atman, to say, well, if we're going to talk about Atman, understand any concept we're going to attach to it is going to be misleading. So how do you think about Brahma? How do you think about Atman? Not this, not that. Okay? Again, very, very, very high degree of convergence between Hindu and Buddhist thought at that point. The notion of compassion, the notion of respect, universal respect for living beings, becoming increasingly important in Hinduism. That's, again, the influence of Buddhism. So, was there a need for a separate Buddhist path? Well, for millions of Indians, there was no need for a separate Buddhist path. At the same time, Hindu kings were stepping up persecution of Buddhism. Why? Well, Buddhism, of course, as we discussed before, doesn't acknowledge the legitimacy of caste. In fact, ignores caste. To this day, sometimes you'll find large groups of untouchables converting en masse to Buddhism, or sometimes to Christianity, and saying, okay, now we're no longer Hindus, and caste doesn't apply to us. Although theoretically today it's not supposed to apply to Hindus either. But, well, gee, if I become a Buddhist, Buddhism doesn't have caste, so I'm no longer an untouchable. Theologically, that makes sense, but as far as the social consequences are concerned, communities generally don't really acknowledge you are no longer an untouchable. Well, okay, so Hindu kings, largely because of the failure to embrace the caste system by Buddhism and by any of the schools of Buddhism, Hindu kings have persecuted Buddhism. If there's no caste, then you don't have any sort of divine right by birth to be a king. That's pretty serious. Or for that matter, for the Brahmins too, you have no divine right to be no obvious right to be considered a holy man or to have the role of priest based on anything other than your conduct, the merit of your character, your personal abilities. Okay, well, whenever you challenge privilege, privilege fights back, and there was persecution of Buddhists. So, in addition to that, there was an invasion by way of Afghanistan into northern India. The Nalanda school was destroyed. Now, this was the world focal point of Buddhist learning. There were thousands of monks, thousands of manuscripts. Well, monks were slaughtered by the thousands, and thousands of manuscripts burnt, irreplaceable things destroyed forever by the invading forces. Basically, you cut off the head of what is a very central focused structure of the religion. It's like if you invaded Rome and destroyed the papacy. Could people still practice Catholicism? Yes, but it would be a major earthquake within how you practice Catholicism. Well, you destroy Nalanda, and it's a somewhat clumsy analogy, but it's somewhat correct too. You no longer have this great center of learning, this great center for training monks, this great center for scholarship. Gone. Okay. Now, for any number of reasons, then, Buddhism loses its major presence in India. However, Buddhism has moved into other countries. The daughter of the Emperor Ashoka, who I mentioned in an earlier lecture, goes all the way to Egypt. Right? In Alexandria, there was a Buddhist monastery. All kinds of speculation about who was influenced and how by whatever would have been taught there. The son of Ashoka goes to Sri Lanka, island nation south of India, and establishes the Theravada tradition there. Buddhism spreads across the Silk Road into China, into Tibet. It's going to be all over the place, and oddly enough, it's in India that you're going to have difficulty finding a major Buddhist presence. So, the Theravadins, some modern Theravadins will claim we are the oldest existing school of Buddhism. This is our teachings are the closest to the authentic Buddhism for reasons we discussed before. The problem of original Buddhism, that's not a claim that is easy to defend, but they are the only one of these 18 early schools that still exists. Okay? And they are the major presence in Sri Lanka, in Burma, in a number of other countries. Vietnamese Buddhism is an incredibly interesting blend of the Theravada tradition and the Zen tradition. It's represented very, very brilliantly by Thich Nhat Hanh, who I will talk about in later lectures when we're talking about East Asian Buddhism. And Thich Nhat Hanh, next to the Dalai Lama, is probably the best known and the most respected living Buddhist teacher. And as I say, this is a combination of Theravada and Zen, which is a much later school. So, what are the differences between the so-called Hinayana and Mahayana? Well, Hinayana means smaller vehicle. Mahayana means greater vehicle. Why is it called the greater vehicle? The original idea was this is a way of practicing that more people will be able to understand and more people will be able to engage in. We've reintroduced things such as art, celestial beings, rituals, and so forth, the kinds of things that people who want to practice a religion generally thirst after. Original Buddhism seems to have been much more austere. We don't need any of that. A Japanese Buddhist priest, I think, put it very, very well in a conversation I had with him back in the 1970s. He said, remember, in the time of the Buddha, there were a lot of people in India who were very close to enlightenment already. He didn't need a lot of fancy stuff to draw people onto the path. They were already ready to jump on the path, and they were almost to their goal. One conversation with the Buddha, one word to them, sometimes simply a gesture, and people achieved enlightenment. So, well, 2,000 years later, there's nobody around who's that good anymore. Okay? This is basically the way he put it. If you want to include more people on the path, you've got to make some compromises with your approach. You've got to make it more attractive, draw people in. And ceremony, music, art, all this sort of thing, stories about celestial beings, that's a way of drawing people onto the path, and once they get onto the path, they no longer need those things anymore because they understand the true path. Okay. A contemporary Tibetan teacher, Chogyam Trungpa, put the difference this way. He said, Hinayana is the path, the straight path with no reverse gear. You want to fool around, you want to amuse yourself, don't get on the Hinayana path. This is serious business. The Mahayana is more of a party, or can be at least. That's not to say that people practicing Mahayana aren't serious or never practice austerity or whatever, because that's simply not true. What it means is, what he meant was, this is something that's more attractive to more people. And so you're going to get more people following it. Initially, this gets them on the path. The idea of the Bodhisattva is very important for Mahayana Buddhism. The Bodhisattva is someone who has devoted himself to the enlightenment of all beings. I will not attain nirvana until every blade of grass is enlightened. Okay, well, what on earth does that mean? It means that my compassion is so boundless that I am practicing this path not for my own sake, for the sake of an illusory self, but for every living being. Okay, that's the ideal of compassion that's emphasized. Now, that notion of bodhisattva, or putting yourself on the path for the sake of all beings, that's there from the earliest strata of Buddhism. Okay, but this is simply a change of emphasis. Okay. In the earlier schools, you have talk about the arhat. The arhat is someone who becomes enlightened very quickly. This is all because of karmic conditions. I'm ready to become enlightened. I don't have to be reborn countless times to tread this path. I'm already poised for enlightenment. And I become enlightened just because I become enlightened. Okay? The idea of delaying your enlightenment, as it's sometimes put, for the sake of all beings, literally doesn't make a whole lot of sense. What am I going to do? Be less mindful, less compassionate? Whoops, almost practiced too much compassion there. I could have become a fully enlightened Buddha. Boy, I almost blew it. No, that's not how it goes. Of course, that's not how it goes. It's a difference in attitude, of emphasis and attitude. Silent Buddha, or Pacceka Buddha, as it is in Pali, particularly modern Japanese writers will say, well, you see how selfish these early people were. This is a Buddha, someone who attains Buddhahood but then doesn't teach. Well, that criticism doesn't make any sense, does it? If you have not developed boundless compassion, how did you become a Buddha to begin with? If you are a Buddha, then you have boundless compassion. Pacceka Buddha means, or silent Buddha, if you will, it means your karmic conditions are such that you become enlightened in circumstances where no one can understand what you're trying to teach them. Okay? It's not that you're not sufficiently compassionate or skillful to teach, it's that there are no students to listen. There is no one to listen to you. Is it possible that there have been enlightened beings throughout history who were essentially silent Buddhas, who found themselves in circumstances where no one would understand them? Yeah, very likely. One landmark in the development of Mahayana is a sutra called the Vimalakirti Sutra, for a couple of reasons. First of all, Vimalakirti is a layperson. He is entertaining the Buddha and several of the Buddha's most illustrious disciples, and he's expounding on Shunyata, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes. Shunyata, or emptiness. Very, very, very central doctrine of the Mahayana. Vimalakirti gives this wonderful, wonderful teaching about emptiness. And what's really odd here, what's really revolutionary, is that he's not a monk. He's a layperson. He's a householder. Another important vantage point of Mahayana is that you do not have to be a monk in order to become enlightened. You can be a householder and be an enlightened being. Okay? Big switch. It's a sort of a shift away from this monastic emphasis and a shift toward being a broader vehicle. Vimalakirti has expounded more profoundly than any of the Buddha's monastic disciples were able to expound. At one point, the celestial Bodhisattva, Avalokiteshvara, who is the embodiment or personification of compassion, appears and endorses and confirms Vimalakirti's teachings, expounds more upon Shunyata. One of the Buddha's disciples, becoming very disgruntled, says, well, if you're so wise and powerful, such a important celestial being, why are you a woman? Why don't you change yourself into a man? Avalokiteshvara changes him into a woman, rather than changing herself into a man, changes him into a woman. Okay? Ha-ha, joke's on you. But way more than that. Look at the relative status of men and women in the culture of that time, the relative status of monastic versus laity in that time. This is a complete reversal. A woman may be more perfectly enlightened than a man, a householder more perfectly enlightened than a monastic. Huge shift here. So, what is shunyata, or emptiness? When Buddhists talk about shunyata, or emptiness, there are a few ways that you can really go wrong in understanding this. Saying that nothing is real, everything is illusion, that's a sort of a denial of the phenomenal world. Tsongkhapa, a great Tibetan Buddhist teacher, once said, if you dwell on the eternal oneness of all things, that's wonderful. For the rest of us, it's best to remember cause and effect. In other words, from this phenomenal side, from this unenlightened side, of course, there's a sense in which this is all real, although it's all anicca. Anicca, dukkha, anatta. It's in a constant state of flux. It's an interdependent, dynamic reality, a continuity, a stream, not an essential self. Okay? So it's not like, okay, well, it doesn't matter if I, kill people. It doesn't matter if I behave really badly toward other people. It doesn't matter if I neglect my own practice, because after all, none of it's real. Robert Pirsig, in his novel Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which was a bestseller back in the late 1970s, early 1980s, Robert Pirsig said he went to Benares Hindu University and a couple of his professors were telling him all the world is illusion. And he said, well, what about the atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Were those illusions? And his teacher said, yes. And Pirsig said, that night I packed my bags. The next morning I got on a plane and went back to the United States. Because as far as I was concerned, if you're going to tell me that this incredible destruction and carnage and death and suffering, that was all just illusion, then you have nothing to teach me. Well, there's a sense in which he's right. There's a sense in which he's not right. Okay? Why do we come into all of this conflict with each other? Why do we have wars? Why do we have greed? Why do we have envy? Why do we have enmity and prejudice? It's because of this illusion that the self is real. It's because of our failure to understand our interconnectedness and our interdependence. So in that sense, they were right. But he was also right as in, look, if you're going to tell me everything's an illusion and just leave it at that, then I have no way of living in the world except to be as stupid and destructive and mean-spirited as everything that actually drove me to seek a spiritual path to begin with. Okay? So you don't want to go the way of saying, yeah, okay, it doesn't matter what you do in the phenomenal world because it's ultimately all illusion. Okay? Is this a new doctrine? I actually spent the better part of a day in Sri Lanka with a very eminent monk, Nyanaponika Thera, discussing the relationship between Shunyata and anicca. And we both pretty much agreed that it was, not by any means a scholar of his caliber, but we pretty much agreed that Shunyata is a natural flowering of the doctrine of anicca. All things are empty of a permanent, essential, unchanging self. They are empty of anything to cling to. They are empty of the kind of reality that keeps us locked in avidya because we're looking for something that we can't find. We're desiring something that can't be fulfilled. That's the sense in which the phenomena are empty. Okay? So from the enlightened side, yeah, it is illusory. From the phenomenal side, it's not simply illusory, it's simply an interdependent, continuous flux. So which is right? They're both right. They're both two different angles at looking at the same thing. Okay. Now, I have to say at this point that people would much wiser than myself would say, be careful. Don't say too much about Shunyata, because you'll give people a perspective or a concept to grasp at. And what Shunyata is about is not grasping. If I might make a cross-cultural comparison, something I'm inclined to do, Socrates very often said that all he was doing was simply, getting the debris out from in front of your face and turning your head toward the light so that you can see for yourself. Well, to a large extent, that's what many of these doctrines are doing. Give up these illusions, give up your ignorance, give up the stuff that you are actually doing unconsciously to yourself to keep yourself suffering and ignorant and don't even realize it. Let go of that. And once you have, you can see for yourself. And be very, very careful that you don't then attach a concept to it. You attach a concept to it, all of a sudden, you're not seeing what's there, you're seeing the concept that stands between you and the reality. Okay? There are people who insist that, Shunyata is unconditional, that from which all arises, and so forth and so forth and so forth, which is a kind of essentially taking little bits and pieces the Buddha said and going way farther with them than he went. That approach will lead you to grasping, will lead you to attachment. It will keep you mired in avidya, which is why the great Mahayana teachers did not embrace it in that way. Okay? People who are eager from a comparative religion standpoint to say, well, Buddhism does have a conception of God. They just, they just go about it in a different way. It's really not true. Essentially, the Buddhist tradition would say, by and large, at least up to this point, when you have to essentially put an anthropomorphic concept on this, you're not even looking at Shunyata anymore. You've got a brick wall of concepts between you and reality. You want to make everything something familiar to yourself. And if you do that, you're going deeper into attachment, and then deeper into avidya, and deeper into suffering. Well, some contemporary teachers say if you look at emptiness as a mode of perception, that's the best way to look at it. It's a mode of perception free of attachments, free of avidya. Remember how we saw that circle of interdependent origination? It's basically shunyata means that we have dissolved that. We're not just unconsciously kicking off that whole cycle in every moment where ignorance, contact, attachment, aversion, etc., 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 leads to the illusion that there is some absolute reality to all of this in the phenomenal world. Okay? One of the most beloved of the Mahayana sutras is the so-called Heart Sutra. It's part of a body of literature that comes from this era called The Perfection of Wisdom. I won't read the whole thing to you. It is very short, but I won't read the whole thing to you. Famously, it says, all things are empty, nothing is born, nothing dies, nothing is pure, nothing is stained, nothing increases and nothing decreases. So in emptiness there is no body, no feeling, no thought, no will, no consciousness. There are no eyes, no ears, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind. There is no seeing, no hearing, no smelling, no tasting, no touching, no imagining. There is nothing seen, nor heard, nor smelled, nor tasted, nor touched, nor imagined. There is no ignorance, there is no end to ignorance. There is no old age and death, there is no end to old age and death. There is no suffering, no cause of suffering. No end to suffering, no path to follow. There is no attainment of wisdom, and no wisdom to attain. Well, what on earth is all that about? Don't get attached to the doctrines. Okay? What do you mean? Isn't this all about, putting an end to the cycle of suffering and old age and ignorance and illness and death and all that? You become attached to those concepts and you've blown it. Okay? They are just a raft to get you across the river, as the Buddha put it. Once you have crossed the river, you don't carry the raft around on your back. You might kick it back for someone else to use it to get across the river. But the raft is only an instrument. This is only upaya. Remember, even those doctrines, even that upaya is itself empty. Okay? The Heart Sutra ends with the phrase, gate, gate, paragate, parasamgate, bodhisvaha, which is oft recited. Again, a beloved piece of sutra, right? Gate, gate, paragate, parasamgate, bodhisvaha. Gone, gone, gone beyond, utterly gone beyond, thus awakened. Okay? If you wanted to sum up the Mahayana in one phrase, you wouldn't go wrong summing it up with that phrase. Gate, gate, paragate, parasamgate, bodhisvaha. So what do you have here? You have wisdom and compassion that spontaneously is seen when you stop deluding yourself. It is your true nature. Don't talk about true nature because then you're going to attach to something. How to approach it then? Well, one Japanese poet put it this way: don't think that the moon arrives when the clouds depart. The moon was there all along.